Yes, folks, welcome back. I'm your host, Matt Leck, in for David. This week, we're going to have an interview for you with a guy by the name of Robert Skvarla. Robert is an assistant editor of over at Diabolique Mag. I don't know why it's hard for me to pronounce that. Diabolique Mag. Talking about different things, most pertinently this new Church Committee 2.0, supposedly run by Jim Jordan. And also we get into some JFK assassination stuff. A little bit short of a show. I will be over on Twitch. Afterwards, I'll be playing a little bit of 2K if you want to come hang out. This will be about 40 minutes. And folks, if you are in the Northeast, if you're in the New York City area and can get to a live show on Sunday, I do want to share this. We do have some tickets left for This Is Revolution, Give Them Argument, Left Reckoning, live from the cutting room. There it is, right near the Empire State Building. Also featuring Sam Cedar, Emma Vigeland, Bhaskar Sankara, and some other guests. So come to that if you can. And also don't forget patreon.com/Left Reckoning. Enjoy this interview with Robert, and I'll see you guys on Twitch in about 45 minutes or so. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck in for David Griscom, and joining me today is Robert Skvarla. Robert is the associate editor. Let me pull up your titles here at Diabolique Magazine. He also has bylines in Cream Magazine, Covert Action Mag, and Atlas Obscura. And he also has his blog at Mondo Americana, where I would recommend, and I'll put in the comments, his article on Alex Jones and the weirding of Bohemian Grove. Robert, thanks so much for joining me today. And just introduce your own work to our audience to make up for my deficiencies there.
No, I mean, you did great. Those are my most notable bylines. The Crane magazine article just came out last month. It's on the CIA's connection to Creedence Clearwater Revival, or rather how they stole money from CCR in the 70s, which will tie into the subject we're talking about today. But that's a lot of the stuff I'm into. The polite way of saying it is parapolitics or deep politics. The impolite way of saying it is conspiracies, conspiracy theories, conspiracy research, community, all of that. So I get into a lot of the less reputable subjects that hover around the world of politics.
Yes, and these are also some of my favorite subjects as well. And I want to talk to you about this in light of this select subcommittee on weaponization of the federal government, because I think the way that this discourse is going to play out is going to be culture warred and not super informative to people. And we already have a guy, James Risen, a guy who I came up with knowing as somebody who was persecuted by the Obama Justice Department, saying there's no such thing as the deep state. We sorted all that stuff out like 40 years ago. Before we deal with Risen's take there, let's go back to what he was talking about when we dealt with all this stuff and what was the original Church Committee? Who was Frank Church? What was its legacy?
Well, it's funny because if we wait a few months, Risen has a book on Frank Church coming out in May. So if you want to learn more about that, I'm sure that should be interesting. But Frank Church was a senator from Idaho. He was elected to office in, I believe, 56 or 57. And he had been one of the more liberal senators in Congress at that time. He was a vocal opponent of the Vietnam War. He supported legislation like the Cooper Church Amendment and the Case Church Amendment to defund and get us out of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. In 73, he had chaired a subcommittee on the involvement of multinational corporations in international actions. Specifically, it was focusing on what was happening in Chile with the coup targeting Salvador Allende. So Church was someone who was probably perfectly suited to lead the Church Committee. But what really brought all that together was a constellation of actions in the early 70s, going back to 71. Over the course of the 60s, the FBI had been involved in a program known as COINTELPRO, which is short for Counterintelligence Program. There were a bunch of them targeting different groups like the Communist Party of the USA, Socialist Workers' Party, Black Panthers, and other groups. But in 1971, a group of activists living around Philadelphia broke into an office in Media, Pennsylvania, and stole a lot of files. They were known as the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. And that sort of got the ball rolling. Journalists became more interested in this. And Seymour Hersh, who had done a lot of investigative journalism on the subject of like the My Lai massacre, he broke the story on the Pentagon's biochemical weapons testing program. In December of 74, he published portions of a series of reports known as Family Jewels, which the CIA had compiled over the course of 1973. And reports detailed all kinds of illegal, sometimes legal, but questionable actions that the CIA had been involved in from its existence, its creation in 1947, all the way up to that time period. So when that broke the following month, in January of 1975, the Senate voted to bring together a committee to investigate all of these things that were happening with the CIA, the FBI, and other agencies like the NSA.
Right. And so like the Family Jewels, let's talk. Can you just go into the Family Jewels a little bit more about that? Because I mean, that's a big in Seymour Hersh's sort of, like, was that his, yeah, like you said, like the My Lai stuff, all that stuff coming at the same time. Talk a little bit more about the Family Jewels.
Yeah. So when CIA Director James Schlesinger came in, he wanted to know what was going on, in part because of accusations that the CIA may have been involved in Watergate. And for people who are involved in parapolitics or interested in it, many people do believe that, Watergate was the second coup after the JFK assassination. I'm a little ambivalent on that reading, but because of accusations of potential involvement in the Watergate scandal, either helping Nixon or going against Nixon, Schlesinger put together this report or series of reports so that he could know everything that was going on within the agency or had gone on. And in the course of that, information leaked to Hersh, who wrote about some of the more notorious actions. I believe the article in the New York Times came out December 22nd, 1974, or somewhere thereabout. And it was just covering all of the things that would eventually come up in the Church Commission, although not in nearly as much detail.
Yeah. And the Church Commission, do you think that was, as far as like the government investigating itself, what do you think like the overall legacy of that is? Because I don't want to get too into the JFK stuff now, but I do know that Gaetan Fonzi was doing JFK assassination stuff. I think that was related to the Church Committee stuff too, and that was not super satisfactory. So, but JFK stuff aside, like how do we judge the Church Commission?
Well, so the committee is interesting in a number of ways. Like I said, Church probably more than anybody, given his stances on Vietnam, given his involvement with the multinational subcommittee in 73. He was someone who was probably best suited to lead it. Mm-hmm. However, I don't believe he was the initial choice. There was another Senator, Philip Hart from Michigan, who was the initial choice, but at that time he was dealing with health issues that would later be revealed to be cancer. And he unfortunately passed away shortly after the committee issued its final reports in 1976. But when you look at the factors that brought it together, one of the problems facing the Church Committee right from the get-go was that there were forces working against them from literally within inside the Senate. Before it had even convened, Barry Goldwater was adamantly opposed. And it's funny because if you look at Goldwater's legacy, he's known as this principled libertarian today. And if you follow that train of thought based on where libertarians typically fall on the CIA, you would think that he'd be opposed to the CIA and its many actions. But he was actually very protective of the agency over the course of the investigation. He was eventually named to be one of the 11 members of the committee, and he tried to stonewall right from the beginning. One of the more notable reports that came out was the CIA's assassination report, basically detailing its involvement in attempts on the life of Fidel Castro, allegedly its involvement in the murder of Patrice Lumumba, although I believe the Church Committee ruled that they didn't actually do it. They only touched on a possible poisoning scheme. Rafael Trujillo, Papa Doc Duvalier, and some other people. But Goldwater actively opposed it the entire time, tried to say that the CIA was not responsible because it was ultimately something that would fall on the president. So right from the beginning, and this is something that can come up with the JFK assassination stuff if you want to talk about that, but Goldwater was trying to pass blame for many of these actions on to the Kennedys specifically.
Yeah.
He attacked what he called the imperial presidency, but his main target was the Kennedys. And this was something other members of the committee, specifically the Republican members, would latch onto. Unfortunately for him, it came out during the course, I believe, of the investigation or shortly after that Goldwater had lied about his knowledge of CIA covert actions and assassination schemes. He had said he had not been aware of any of this, but he had actually been briefed in 72 or 73. So probably someone within the agency was feeding him information and stonewalling him. But this also happened with William Colby, the CIA director, at the beginning of the hearings. He stonewalled the agency. Gerald Ford, the president, did everything he could to stop it. And there were complementary committees that have been formed. The Rockefeller Commission was brought together with then Vice President Nelson Rockefeller. And so with the Rockefeller Commission, they were going into a lot of the same stuff. And when they got into the assassinations, they realized this was something they didn't want to touch on. So they tried to prevent handing over materials that they had received to the Church Committee. And then there was the Pike Committee, which was in the House, which was probably even more aggressive in some ways than the Church Committee. And there was some tension there between the two committees over who would get to information first, who would reveal things first, and how to go about things. The Church Committee was a more polite version of the investigation. They weren't trying to issue subpoenas. One of the big things the Pike Committee had done is they'd issued subpoenas to then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Frank Church did not want to do this because he knew it would not work, or at least in his opinion, it would not work. And he was someone who believed in getting wins. He didn't want to put losses out there publicly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would you say like there were, so I think that like knowing about those assassination plots, for instance, like that is a win, even though like I guess like we as a body politic haven't maybe internalized the lessons from what our government was doing in especially the early Cold War.
Yeah, the assassination report specifically was a big point of contention because even some of the Democratic members were a little sketchy about releasing it for a number of reasons. First, Church was someone who was very big on transparency. I believe in 1968, there was a special executive meeting for the Senate's Foreign Intelligence Committee on the subject of the Gulf of Tonkin, where it was revealed that obviously the Gulf of Tonkin didn't happen as it was said to have occurred. And there was a quote where he said something to the effect of, in a democracy, you cannot expect people to want to exercise judgment if the truth is concealed to them. So he was someone who always pushed for transparency, and he was the driving force behind the assassination report. So the fact that it even got out there is kind of a shock, given how much resistance was there from so many people. And in many ways, it was because even some of the Democratic senators were worried about how it might embarrass the United States. So, for example, like the plots on Fidel Castro's life, where we tried to blow up a cigar, we tried to put phthalate salts in his boots to make his beard fall out. All of this stuff came out, and some of it looked silly. So some of it would embarrass the United States in that way. But in more serious ways, we tried to kill active heads of state in peacetime. So that would not reflect well on us either.
And this is like this whole stuff. This is what frustrates me about this, is because like it would embarrass us, but really what those folks did in hiding this is infantilize an entire nation of people, because we all look back at this time and basically like the conventional wisdom is, oh, we just outcompeted everyone with our great ideas. Right. And it's like, I just think of like the Kennedy assassination or all these assassinations around the world, like Lumumba, like my parents were like toddlers. And you know, it's and like the sort of it's one thing to find out about this stuff later, but when the conventional wisdom has sort of already started rolling on this, I don't know how you look at that sort of like difficulty with getting people to like understand actual history and our actual place in the world.
Totally. And that's something Church himself would often point to. He was saying that these actions were making us less safe abroad because of if we would get negative attention from ally country or an enemy country because of this, it's something that probably would have happened anyway, because at some point this would leak. That was one of the big things, I believe, with the release of the assassination report. One of the arguments that Church and one of the other high-ranking Democratic members on the committee, Walter Mondale, made was this information is going to get out there at some point. The family jewel stuff had already leaked to Hersh by the end of 74. So this information will make it out there. We need to place it in a context where we can at least provide people an understanding of why it happened. Now, obviously, that doesn't make it better. Mm-hmm. We know that, for example, the attempts on Castro's life are in many ways absurd and in many ways more troubling. But, you know, the big point of what Church was pushing for was transparency so people can make up their mind. And in many ways, that's commendable. Although I do believe in some ways it may have been a bit naive too.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't help think of like even when I was going to college, communication studies, we talk about the Bay of Pigs, and like the lesson is like, make sure we don't have groupthink. And it's like, I don't know if that's the only thing that we need to know about like what was going on with the Bay of Pigs. I think like more of like what the agitation by like leading military leaders and the importance of diplomacy might be more important than like the importance of viewpoint diversity in a boardroom, for instance.
Yeah, and I don't think that would have probably helped in a situation where, you know, Alan Dulles and other members of like the National Security Council and other people high ranking in the government at the Pentagon specifically, they were trying to push JFK to invade Cuba. It wasn't like viewpoint diversity would have helped there. That's not something that, you know, they had an idea of what they wanted and they were going to try and get us to that point where we could declare war on Cuba.
Exactly. All right, so let's move forward to this select subcommittee on the weaponization of the federal government. I guess just give us your outline on this. I don't want to bias the question too much.
Well, so far, there isn't really a whole lot to go on. I believe the only person who's been named officially is Jim Jordan, who was supposed to chair the committee. And I believe it's
not exactly Frank Church.
Yeah, and it's being said, I believe, Thomas Massie is that his name? The other representative, libertarian-leaning Republican, is probably going to end up on there. So those are the only two we can probably be certain of. The Democrats have said they will participate. You know, they're not going to do what the Republicans did with the January 6th committee. So it's going to be difficult to see how it goes, because to even call this a Church committee is dishonest in the sense that it's happening in a different body of Congress. This would be more akin to the Pike Committee, which happened in the House. But like the idea of the weaponization of government is a little strange given the people who are going to be running this, because one of the things that you get into with parapolitics is discussion of something known as the deep state. Now, you can view this in a number of different ways. Many people call it a right-wing conspiracy theory. Risen called that a conspiracy theory when he talked about the Church committee in that tweet. I take a different perspective on that because it's a term that predates Trump's appropriation of it. It goes back to, I believe, people like Peter Dale Scott and other writers who've mentioned it. And there's applications in things like Turkish government where it's been used in many ways. Even American writers were talking about, you know, shadow governments as far back as the 80s. Mm-hmm. So when you're discussing something like the deep state, there is this distinction between the government as we see it publicly and those institutions that exist beneath the surface, which exist to perpetuate themselves. Institutions like the CIA, FBI, now DHS, which exists today but didn't in the 70s. So these have always been political institutions in the sense that they've had explicitly political targets. The FBI formed in, I think, officially 1908, and within a decade, it was targeting exclusively communists and anarchists. And then over the course of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, it became a red hunting institution almost exclusively. Famously, J. Edgar Hoover denied the existence of La Cosa Nostra, mafia, for years because he was worried about the threat of communism. Other House and Senate institutions like the House Un-American Activities Committee, which this is probably going to more closely resemble, had an explicitly political slant to it, where it was focused initially on finding un-American activities. So it focused on some right-wing groups like the KKK, but eventually it became exclusively a communist hunting institution. So what I'm seeing here with Jordan, Massie, and the people who will probably end up on there is it will probably be more something akin to HUAC.
Interesting. Yeah, that's not I mean, HUAC, for folks who don't know, like that's, McCarthyism, all that stuff.
Yeah. So one of the things about that, which is interesting, is that it was formed by a Southern Democrat, Martin Deese. It was initially the Deese Committee, I believe, in 38, and it investigated some right-wing stuff. Mm-hmm. I believe like the American Legion's involvement in the business plot and certain things were looked into, but it wasn't something that it was never going to focus on the right-wing forces that existed in the country at that time. And Deese and others eventually moved right to attack the New Deal. And it specifically became a vehicle to attack the Works Progress Administration and other New Deal projects, which helped obviously perpetuate McCarthyism and many of the other things that were happening at the time. So what we're seeing with this new House subcommittee that they're going to be forming, I suspect it will be something similar where it's communist infiltration of Twitter and Facebook and social media agencies or organizations.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I doubt it will be like sort of Saudi or Israeli infiltration of that. It will be, Chinese party.
Well, it's going to be, it's going to focus. I mean, so one of the things that you see between the two political parties today is, do you want to fight Russia or do you want to fight China?
Yeah.
And on the right specifically, they're worried about infiltration of China of all sorts of different institutions. And social media appears to be one where they think the Chinese or the communists, they conflate the two, have taken over everything. So that's something that will probably come up depending on who's on the committee.
Yeah. So let's move to like best of a world situation where it's not Jim Jordan, or Jim Jordan is your mind control asset and you're able to control his every move on that committee. What do you think we actually should, a church committee would look into after all these years? I mean, because we know, just to go in the decade after, like Iran-Contra, like this sort of stuff didn't stop happening. I'm curious what your points of emphasis would be.
Well, so one of the big things to talk about with that is what we learned with the church committee. And there was lots of stuff that came out, notably, I think a lot of people, when they think of the church committee, they think of church holding up the heart attack gun, the shellfish toxin. So that was one of the more like lurid details, but there was lots of stuff that came out about COINTELPRO and specifically the NSA and its involvement with private companies. One of the things that came up were two sister programs, Project Shamrock and Project Minaret, and they involved the use of telecommunications companies, RCA, Global, and ITT, to spy on Americans who were communicating with individuals abroad. That information was taken as part of Project Shamrock, and then under Project Minaret, it was shared with the FBI and other organizations so that those organizations, those agencies could spy on Americans. And ironically, Frank Church was one of the people who ended up getting caught under Minaret. He was surveilled. So as like a complement to that, today, there are things you could look into, specifically what's known as the third party doctrine, where in the United States, if you agree to share your information with a private company, they are allowed to do almost whatever they want with it based on their terms of service. So when you click yes on the TOS on an app, a dating app, anything, they can sell your data. And people understand this, but I don't think they fully comprehend the scope of what happens with this. So, for example, in 2016, during the Ferguson protests, there was a company, Geopedia, who was getting this information, purchasing it from Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And they were getting special access to this, which they were then providing to law enforcement agencies so that they could provide geolocation data on protesters. The Pentagon, military, has worked with companies, I believe it was first known as Xmode and now is known as Outvoice. They had a constellation of apps that they created, one of which was a Muslim dating app, and they would sell that information to the military. So you see all of this happening where this is almost identical in a way to what was happening with Shamrock and Minaret, although it's not necessarily abroad. But even with that, within the last year, Senator Ron Wyden released information on the CIA collecting bulk data of Americans as part of, there isn't an official name for it, but the CIA has been doing it for at least a decade, where they just collect all kinds of like large stores of data and they don't sort it. So Americans get caught up in that. DHS, everything that they did in the 2020 George Floyd protests is comparable, if not worse, than COINTELPRO. They were literally kidnapping protesters in unmarked vans. There was the Antifa guy who just got gunned down one day after he allegedly shot someone. So there's all kinds of crazy shit that's happening in the government that you could look into. Mm-hmm. But what we're going to hear about is, Matt Taibbi's Twitter files. We're going to hear these stories about stuff that we already knew had happened. We knew that the government had access to geolocation data because people had reported on it, or the ACLU had released a report on it. So we're going to hear a very skewed version about Republicans being targeted for cracking jokes on Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things that, first of all, going back to Wyden's always interested me because his dad, I know, wrote a book on the Bay of Pigs back in the day. I'm just curious what your take on Wyden is on these issues.
I actually like him. I mean, he's one of the last of that like old style Democrat, specifically from like the 70s. They all sort of seem to disappear around 1980, and there's probably a reason for that, especially with the church specifically. But he cares about surveillance. He cares about civil liberties. He cares about all the things Democrats sort of pay lip service to now, but don't do anything about. So he's been a vehicle in many ways for getting information out there. He was the one who released the information on the CIA bulk data collection program earlier this year or last year. So Wyden is someone who, if you're going to do a Senate committee, like a new church committee, it would have to be Wyden who would lead it because he's the only person I could trust.
Yeah. And, the other thing, you mentioned ITT, and it's one thing that always frustrates me with the sort of right theory of deep state is it completely leaves out corporate America.
Yeah.
And it's all just like these government bureaucracies. But you look at ITT, right there, that's a like a sort of privatized part of the deep state that is working hand in hand with the American government.
Yeah, they were heavily involved in the Watergate scandal, like the Dita Beard memo that came out revealing the connection to ITT. They were involved in the coup against Allende. Mm-hmm. They've had many crazy connections to intelligence agencies historically. So you're absolutely right when you say private corporations function in a way where they function as an arm of the government. And one of the things that I'm curious to see is which members of the Republican House make it into this committee, specifically people like Matt Gaetz and Chip Roy, who have strong ties to defense contractors. They receive donations, or Gaetz is married to Palmer Luckey's sister, Ginger, and he runs a defense firm that has contracts securing the southern border right now. So it will be interesting to see like which people with connections to that component of the deep state end up on this committee.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, in our remaining time, I want to move and bounce some JFK stuff off to you. Folks who've listened know, I was actually thinking about doing a JFK podcast like 5 or some years ago, and I decided putting myself in that mind space every single week probably wasn't the best, for my mental health. But it's a subject that I'm very fascinated in. I'm just curious what your personal history is with assassination stuff, because the thing about being on the left with Kennedy assassination stuff is you have leftists who think you're apologizing for the Democrats and Cold War hawk, and it's true that Kennedy was a Cold War hawk, and then you have people who just think that there's no way that this would happen. So I'm just curious your history with JFK assassination stuff.
Yeah, it's something I've been around my entire life. I'm in my late 30s, so I saw JFK not when it came out, but when I was growing up. I was a big fan of the X-Files, so this stuff was always on the periphery for me, but it wasn't until my late 20s that I started to become really interested in it, when I became interested in many of these other subjects. And my personal opinion is the CIA did it. I don't know if the mafia was involved. I think there was probably something there, maybe Cubans, Bay of Pigs. I don't know specifically who did it, but I believe that there's enough circumstantial evidence, a preponderance of evidence to reasonably come to that conclusion. Mm-hmm. Like when you say people on the left think you're excusing JFK, one of the problems, and this is something you see a lot on the left, is, I hate to use the phrase purity politics, but if people don't have, exactly the right type of anti-imperialist politics right from the get-go, they're automatically sus, or they're automatically, they're not a valid member of the movement. And I think if you look at JFK over the term of his presidency, there was an evolution. There's reason to believe he was actually looking to de-escalate the Vietnam conflict. I forget the name of the order that he put out, but it was looking to have troop withdrawal over the next, I believe, year and a half to 2 years. By the end of 64 or 65, he had set up a back channel of communication with Fidel Castro. They were trying to set up talks, and literally the day he was assassinated, Castro, who was speaking with a Kennedy representative, said to the man, "They're going to blame me for it." And they did. They tried to.
I just jump in there. Castro's reaction is, I think, when I was first like sort of buying into some of these theories, was the most revealing. I think un mala noticia, I think he called it, when it finally found out that Kennedy, first he thought like it'll be good if he survives because he'll win re-election, and then he said that he lost, it'd be bad news. And I think that is from a guy who, I think the Kennedys are complicit in, at least allowing covert plots against him, because RFK was Department of Justice, like that stuff is true enough. But I mean, take it from Castro himself.
No, totally. And that's the thing. Like, the Kennedys did bad things. You don't have to pretend they didn't. They were, Kennedy was a senator before he became president, and he was a president. He was a Cold Warrior. Yep. And as he got in, I think he just realized the scope of what was happening. I mean, he worked through intermediaries to de-escalate the Cuban Missile Crisis. He had people like Curtis LeMay in the National Security Council telling him to bomb Cuba. Mm-hmm. The CIA tried to get him to invade Cuba with the Bay of Pigs. And I think over time, he realized the scope of what was happening and the potential for human error, where maybe a nuclear weapon could come into play. And that probably scared him. And true to what Castro was saying, the CIA did try to frame him. There was a man named Gilberto Alvarado, who shortly after the assassination came out and said he saw Oswald in Mexico City get I think $6,500 or $7,500 from a Soviet agent. And even after this had been debunked by the FBI, they continued trying to push it. I think it was John McCone who tried to release this to Drew Pearson, the journalist. Pearson obviously figured something was off and didn't print it. So there's a lot that goes around in different aspects of the JFK assassination where there's enough credible circumstantial evidence for a person to reasonably believe our government was involved.
Yeah, and I just think it's one thing that's fascinating to me is how this is, like, when I first got into it 10 years ago, it was sort of seemed like a sort of niche interest, but you realize it's just kind of like it's the adult way to look at what happened, and especially with just what's being revealed. And it's also interesting how it's slowly permeating culture, because you mentioned the X-Files. I recently went back and watched that X-Files. They get a lot of they obviously put their own sort of editorial or narrative arc on it and who the cast of characters is, but some of the stuff that they're talking about is very relevant to our actual understanding of what's been revealed about. I mean, just from what we know about the CIA with regards to COINTELPRO, like you say, or Operation Northwoods, was it LeMay or Lemnitzer, one of those guys wanted us to stage domestic terror attacks as a pretext for war in Cuba. And it's just that stuff happened, and it's there's this, I think I don't think NBC News, for instance, is letting has let their audience come to process it as well as they need to. And it's this weird thing where it's almost like they thought they could gaslight people for a long time. And there's all this great history of the people who've been on this JFK stuff from the 70s and whatever, doing this grassroots history, and they've won, I feel like. And so now you have this thing where Tucker Carlson has to be oh yeah, it's all, what's this? And this is actually probably against us somehow. And I don't know how you feel how it's playing out.
Yeah, I mean, the Carlson stuff is interesting because he was a big booster of the CIA for years. He wrote a hit piece on Gary Webb in 95 or 96 for the Weekly Standard, a conservative rag, basically accusing, I forget the specifics of it, basically accusing Webb of either fabricating evidence or misrepresenting things. Mm-hmm. And this was actually common. I mean, the New York Times and the Washington Post, they all did this to Webb, but they haven't come around, decades later to say the CIA assassinated JFK. He was also someone who claims that he was a bagman for the Contras. He says he went down there on a college break or something like that and pass money along. So there's an implication there that even if he wasn't CIA, he was working for like the National Endowment for Democracy or some organization that may have been trying to help fund them covertly. So the idea that someone like this, someone who believes we should go to war with China, believes that the CIA assassinated Kennedy, I don't think he sincerely believes it. I think it's something that's useful for him as a new prong in the culture wars.
And this is why I want to talk about this a little bit more, because I do see especially on Majority Report, we do get a little bit more of the institutionalist, I don't want to say naive, but that's what I think, takes on some of this stuff. And it would be a real shame if you had the only people sort of elaborating JFK and the CIA like cover up would be like Marjorie Taylor Greene and
Hey, Matt, are you there? It looks like you froze.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm here now. I was just saying, can you see me now, Robert?
Yeah. You just froze there for a second, so I couldn't hear you.
Cool. Yeah. I was just saying it'd be a big shame if, as this stuff continues to be revealed along lines that I think are predictable. Like there's all this bullshit about like, was it an accident by the Secret Service guy or whatever? The Kennedy stuff that's interesting to me is like, Oswald was at Atsugi Air Base and he did all this extremely like spooky stuff. As that's being sort of documented, the only people talking about it are Tucker and Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Unfortunately, yeah. And I mean, so when you get into Oswald, there's lots of strange things. There's a great writer, he used to write it in the Washington Post. So if you need like some legitimate credential there, his name is Jefferson Morley. And he runs Substack, JFK Facts. I think he wrote for Kennedy and Kennedy's and King, and a number of other sites related to the JFK assassination. But he's been looking into CIA operations, Amspell and Dreamspell, with CIA officer George Janitis. And the implication there is that Oswald may have been used as some kind of asset in New Orleans with the Fair Play for Cuba committee, because when Oswald went there, he just set up a chapter of that committee against the wishes of the main organization. Mm-hmm. He staged fights with, members of the Amspell program to publicly let it be known he was in support of Castro. So there's lots there that you can like cling to and find new information, and people are still finding new information on it. So this idea that someone like Tucker would come in and just suddenly say, yeah, they did it. And this guy I know off the record from the CIA said they did it. It just, I don't know. It doesn't work for me because there's people who actually have put in the work and are doing the research, finding things, going through archives. And here's this idiot who for decades supported the CIA suddenly saying the CIA did it. I can't trust him in any meaningful way.
Yeah, I'd just say I when I went to New Orleans, I did make a point of going to 544 Camp Street. That stuff is so wild. Like like what Oswald's doing in New Orleans. Literally, there's a 40-minute radio interview that you can watch on YouTube of him being like, "Yeah, I'm a Marxist-Leninist," and everyone, if I'm the most famous Marxist-Leninist in Bourbon Street.
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense. Like this guy who Marine, right? It was Marine Corps that he was in.
Yep.
He was stationed at Atsugi. He then goes to the Soviet Union. He defects, is allowed to come back to the United States without any repercussions. I think the State Department even gave him money. He then hangs out with right-wing anti-communist Russians.
George Bush.
Bush. That have all kinds of strange intelligence connections. He then moves to New Orleans and publicly puts himself as the public face of Marxism. It doesn't make sense. If anyone else did this, it would be like, this guy is clearly being used as some kind of asset or something,
Absolutely. Well, Robert Skvarla, thanks so much. We got to have you back, talk about Alex Jones and some other parapolitics stuff.
Sure.
It's been great talking to you. And give your plugs one more time for folks.
Sure. So I have a new article in Cream Magazine. You can get it from their site. I think it's creammag.com. I've written for a bunch of other sites, but mostly I'm on Twitter. So if you want to follow me, a lot of what I post is there. That's at Robert Skvarla, and I'll let you figure out how to spell that.
Thanks, Robert.
Thanks, Matt.